She built an empire beside him, stood in blood, in ash, in the wreckage of 3 border wars, and never once flinched. Luna Evelina Blackthorn gave that king everything a wolf could give: loyalty that didn't bend, courage that didn't break, a presence that held the court together when he was too proud to ask for help. And tonight, during the kingdom's most sacred celebration, she found out none of it mattered. Not the sacrifices, not the years, not her. Drop your city in the comments right now, because where you're watching from, I need you to stay until the very end. This story is about to change everything you thought you knew about power. She smelled the lie before she saw it. That was the thing about being Luna for 11 years. You learn to read the air the way other women read expressions. The Crimson Fang Kingdom had its own scent, a layered mix of pine smoke and iron, and the particular musk of wolves who'd spent generations building something worth protecting. Evelina knew every corner of that smell. She'd walked those corridors since she was 22, new and sharp-eyed and convinced that marrying Kael Draven meant marrying into purpose. The Moon Festival filled the palace with competing aromas: roasted meat, honeyed wine, the perfumed oils the noblewomen wore for occasions like this. Lanterns swayed from every archway in the grand hall. 300 guests at minimum, the cream of Crimson Fang's allied territories, every alpha and beta family who owed the crown a presence. Evelina had organized this festival herself. Every placement, every menu, every ceremonial sequence. 12 weeks of preparation distilled into one night that was supposed to celebrate the kingdom's unity. She stood near the upper gallery railing in a gown the color of dark blood, her brown hair braided back hard enough to pull at her temples. Below, the celebration rolled forward with appropriate grandeur. Kael sat at the head of the ceremonial table, broad-shouldered and golden in his formal armor, laughing at something the beta commander had said. He looked like a king. He always looked like a king. That had never been the problem. The problem was the smell. Beneath the festival perfumes, underneath the wine and smoke, there was something that didn't fit. Something private. A scent she'd encountered twice in the last month and dismissed both times as misdirection. A young woman's perfume, floral and warm, lingering in spaces where it had no business being. She'd noticed it once near Kael's private study. Once in the east corridor that connected the royal wing to the guest suites. She noticed it now, threading through the crowd below like a needle through cloth. Evelina gripped the railing. Her eyes moved across the hall with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned long ago not to show her thinking in public. 300 guests, 12 tables, the ceremonial dais where Kael held court. And then, at the far end near the garden entrance, a woman Evelina recognized. Celine Voss, daughter of the Voss noble family from the Southern Territory. Young, 24 at most. Dark hair loose around her shoulders in a style that was informal for an event this formal. She hadn't been on the original guest list. Evelina knew because she had written the guest list herself. She turned from the railing and walked, not quickly, down the gallery steps toward the main floor. Her expression didn't shift. That was something she'd mastered early. The ability to move through a political space without broadcasting the weather inside her chest. It had served her through border negotiations where men wanted her flustered. Through grief, after 2 miscarriages in years 3 and 5 of her marriage, the loss is quiet and brutal and handled mostly alone because Aluna wasn't supposed to break in front of the court. Through every meeting where someone looked at Kael when they should have been addressing her, she walked toward the garden entrance. She wasn't going to find anything, she told herself. She was going to find a young noblewoman who'd arrived late and entered through the wrong door, and that would be the end of this cold feeling crawling up the back of her neck. The garden doors were cracked open 2 inches, just enough for air, just enough for sound. She pushed them open. The garden was lit with festival lanterns strung low between the cypress trees, and the light was warm and amber, and it fell across 2 figures near the stone bench at the garden's center. Kael with his formal armor jacket removed, his sleeves pushed to the elbows. Celine Voss with her hand pressed flat against his chest, her face tipped up toward him. His hand was on her lower back. Not her waist. Lower. With the proprietary ease of a man who knew that terrain. Evelina stood in the doorway. She didn't move. The sound of the festival behind her, the music, the laughter, 300 people celebrating a kingdom, became something distant and mechanical, like noise heard through water. Her body registered what her mind was still organizing. The scent hit her fully now, no competing aromas to dilute it. Kael's scent and Celine's scent, worn together, layered the way two things get when they've been close often enough and long enough to stop being separate. This wasn't tonight. This had been going on for months. Kael heard the door. His head turned. For 2 full seconds, neither of them spoke. Celine went rigid against him, her hand dropping from his chest. Kael's expression did something complicated. It moved through surprise and then guilt, and then, almost imperceptibly, the particular look of a man who has been caught and is already calculating exits. Evelina. His voice came out level. That almost broke her. The levelness of it. Not shame, calibration. Don't, she said. Just that word. Don't. Because whatever he was about to say, whatever construction of language he'd assembled in those 2 seconds, she didn't want it. She already knew the shape of it. She'd heard variations of it her entire married life. Those careful, diplomatic non-answers that managed to mean everything and nothing simultaneously. Celine stepped back from him. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide, and she had the expression of someone who had known this moment was coming and still wasn't prepared for it. That told Evelina something. This girl hadn't been reckless. She'd been careful. She'd participated in something that required maintenance and concealment, and she'd done it for long enough to get comfortable. "I'm sorry," Celine said. Her voice was small. "Don't apologize to me," Evelina said. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe me nothing." She looked at Kael. "He does." Kael held her gaze. His jaw was tight, that muscle in his cheek that appeared when he was bracing for something. She'd mapped that face so many times. In lamplight and battlefield smoke and the gray mornings after bad news. She knew every expression in his repertoire, and she knew that the one he wore right now wasn't remorse. It was the expression of a man deciding how much to give. "Come inside," he said. "We can talk. Inside." She repeated the word. "You want to go inside? Back into the hall? Back to the festival I planned? Back to 300 guests who are currently eating food I sourced and sitting at tables I arranged?" She paused. "Tell me something, Kael. How long?" Silence. "How long?" "Evelina, I am going to ask you once more," she said, and her voice dropped, quiet and precise and nothing like screaming, which she understood would have been easier for him to manage. Screaming was emotion. This was something different. "How long has this been happening?" He looked at the lanterns above them. A small, involuntary gesture of a man who cannot find the ceiling of his own dishonesty. 8 months. The garden seemed to contract around her. 8 months. She had organized the Spring Border Summit 8 months ago. She had ridden with the Eastern Patrol commanders 8 months ago, representing the Crown while Kael recovered from a minor injury she had told the court was more serious than it was to protect his image. 8 months ago, she had negotiated the grain treaty with the Ashford Pack that had expanded Crimson Fang's trade routes and been praised in open council. 8 months, she said. I didn't... He stopped. You didn't what? I didn't plan for it to Don't finish that sentence. She stepped forward, 1 step, close enough that he couldn't look at the lanterns anymore. Don't tell me it wasn't planned. Everything in this kingdom is planned. You have never done anything in your life without calculating it first. That is what makes you a decent king. She held his gaze. It's what makes this worse. Celine had moved several feet away, near the garden wall, her arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't fleeing, she was waiting. That registered too. Not panic, but a kind of terrible patience. Evelina looked at her. Are you pregnant? The silence was its own answer, but Selina's hands moved fractionally, instinctively, toward her abdomen, a gesture she probably didn't intend to make. The world rearranged itself. Evelina stood in the garden of the palace she had kept for 11 years and understood that the thing she was standing in the middle of was not an affair. It was a replacement. Not an impulsive betrayal, but something structural. Something that had been building in the negative space of her marriage while she was busy holding the marriage's public surface together. She had been the frame. He had been building a different house behind it. She turned and walked back through the garden doors. The noise of the festival rose around her, warm and oblivious. 300 wolves celebrating a kingdom they thought was intact. The music was something traditional, strings and low percussion. The lanterns burned amber and steady. A servant passed her with a tray and said something polite, and she nodded without hearing the words. She walked to the center of the grand hall. She didn't decide to stop there, exactly. It was more that her legs understood something her mind was still catching up to, that the only power she had in this moment was the moment itself. In 20 minutes, or 10, or 5, the narrative would shift from what she'd discovered to how she'd reacted. That was how courts worked. Emotion became the story. And Evelina Blackthorne had spent 11 years refusing to be the story. Tonight, she was going to be the story. She looked toward the royal dais where Kael's empty seat waited. She looked at the assembled alphas and nobles, the territory leaders and their wives, the senior commanders and the Beta Council. 300 people who knew her face and her title and believed right now that they understood her position. "I need your attention," her voice carried. 11 years of council meetings had built a voice that knew how to fill a room. The music stopped. Not dramatically, just the natural cessation that happens when something shifts in the air. Heads turned, conversations dissolved. Even the servers paused. Queen Mother Ravenna Draven, seated at the lateral table reserved for the royal family, looked up. She was a handsome woman in her mid-60s, silver-haired and precise, with eyes the color of old amber that had catalogued every political development in Crimson Fang for 30 years. Her expression in that moment was unreadable, which told Evelina everything. She wasn't surprised. She was assessing. She knows, Evelina thought. She's known. "My name is Evelina Blackthorne," she said to the hall. "Luna of the Crimson Fang Kingdom. Most of you know me as the woman beside your king. Some of you have known me since before that, since I was the Blackthorne daughter who rode north with nothing but a recommendation from her father and a willingness to work harder than any noblewoman this court expected." She paused. "I want to tell you something tonight that your king should have told you himself." The garden doors opened behind her. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She felt Kael enter the hall, felt it in the way the room's attention fractured, half staying on her and half shifting to track him. She knew exactly where he was standing. Alpha King Kael Draven has been conducting a private affair for the last 8 months with Celine Voss, a noble woman of the Southern Territory who has been living inside this palace with the apparent knowledge of the royal family. She let that land. Heard the change in the room's breathing. Celine Voss is currently pregnant with his child. The hall did not erupt. It was quieter than that, which was worse. The sound of 300 people recalibrating, whispers beginning at the edges, the sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the Beta Council table, the scrape of a chair as someone stood and then thought better of it. Evelina kept her voice even. She was not shaking. She cataloged that as information. Her hands were still, her breathing was regulated. The grief was there, but it was currently behind something harder and more useful. She would deal with the grief later, in a room without witnesses. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," she said. "I'm telling you this because I have spent 11 years building this court's trust, and I will not have that trust contaminated by a secret I didn't make." She finally turned. Kael. He was standing 20 feet behind her, still in his formal attire, Celine at a distance near the garden doors. His face held the particular quality of a man being publicly stripped of something he assumed was protected. Not remorse, something closer to exposure. "Is what I said accurate?" she said. The hall waited. Kael said nothing. That silence was its own confession. She'd understood he might not answer, that his instinct would be containment, even now. What she hadn't anticipated was how much the silence would cost him, watching 300 faces read it in real time. "Your Luna has asked you a question," said Commander Aldrich Sen from the Beta table. He was 70 years old and had served under Kael's father, and he spoke with the flatness of a man who had survived 3 regime changes and wasn't intimidated by this one. Kael looked at Evelina. Something moved behind his eyes. She'd seen that expression only a handful of times in their marriage. The rare moment when the political Kael slipped and something rawer surfaced. Pain, possibly. Caught somewhere between the calculation and whatever remained of the man she thought she'd known. "It's accurate," he said. The room fractured, not loudly. There was no theatrical chaos, no overturned tables. It was the sound of a court in the process of restructuring its understanding of itself. Rapid whispers, the rustle of movement as people leaned toward each other, the particular acoustic quality of 300 people trying to find the new ground. And then, Ravenna stood. She rose from her lateral seat with the unhurried authority of a woman who had been managing crises since before most people in this hall were born. Her silver gown caught the lantern light. Her face was composed with a precision that Evelina recognized immediately. Not calm, but manufactured calm, the kind that came from decades of practice. She moved to the center of the hall with a bearing that didn't hurry, and the room gave her space the way rooms always gave Ravenna Draven space, because something in how she moved commanded it. "My dear," she said. She addressed Evelina the way a judge addresses someone who has just said something inadmissible. "You are upset. That is understandable." Ravenna's voice was warm at the surface and cold everywhere underneath. "But I would ask you to consider what you're doing to this kingdom tonight." "I'm doing what should have been done months ago," Evelina said. "You are making a spectacle of the crown during our most sacred celebration." Ravenna looked across the hall, briefly, taking a temperature reading she didn't need because she already knew the room. Then she looked back at Evelina. "And I think, if you're honest with yourself, you know why this happened." Evelina went still. "A king needs an heir," Ravenna said. The words came out measured, each one placed with the care of someone who had thought about this speech far in advance. "That is not politics. It is nature. It is the foundation of everything we are. You have been Luna of this kingdom for 11 years, Evelina. 11 years, and this kingdom still has no heir." The pause was precisely calibrated. "My son did not seek comfort elsewhere because he is cruel. He sought it because he is a king, and kings need what their kingdom requires." The hall had gone very quiet. Evelina felt the shift, felt the room's weight redistributing the way it always did when Ravenna spoke. Not because people agreed with her necessarily, but because she had the ability to introduce a narrative frame so quickly and so confidently that the room had to decide whether to reject it, and most rooms, given the choice, preferred the frame that required less confrontation. "You're calling me barren," Evelina said. The word was flat, clinical. She refused to let it have texture. "I'm calling you a woman who could not give her husband what he needed," Ravenna said, "and a Luna who chose to humiliate her king before 300 witnesses rather than handle her marriage privately, as any woman with real dignity would have done." There it was, the pivot. Faster than Evelina had expected, though she understood she shouldn't have been surprised. Ravenna had been doing this for 30 years. She didn't react, she redirected. She didn't defend, she reframed. The question was no longer whether Kael had betrayed his wife. The question, as of 15 seconds ago, was whether Evelina's behavior tonight was appropriate for a Luna. Half the room was watching Ravenna now. The other half was watching Evelina. She understood that whatever she said next would define the next several weeks of her life. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, in her jaw, behind her eyes. She could feel the 11 years pressing against the back of her ribcage. All of it, the work and the loss, and the two private griefs she'd carried without ever asking anyone to carry them with her. She could feel how much she wanted to scream and how completely she refused to. "I did not humiliate my king," she said. "His choices did that. I simply refused to pretend I didn't see them." She looked across the hall. Not at Kael. He'd made his choice the moment he stayed silent while his mother spoke. Not at Ravenna, who had probably anticipated every response Evelina was capable of. She looked at the faces she knew, Beta Commander Sen, who had watched with something hard and unhappy in his eyes. Lord Hector Ashfall from the Eastern Territory, who had negotiated 3 treaties with her directly and knew her competence wasn't decorative. Lady Mira Caldwell, who had stood beside Evelina during the wolf sickness outbreak 4 years ago, when every healer in the kingdom had been overwhelmed, and Evelina had managed the quarantine personally. She looked at those faces, and she made a decision. Not tonight. Not in this hall, in this light, in front of this many witnesses who were still sorting the narrative. She would not fight Ravenna tonight. Not because she couldn't, but because she needed to know exactly what she was fighting first. "I've said what needed to be said," Evelina told the hall. "I'll leave you to your festival." She walked toward the main corridor without haste. Straight spine, head level, the way she'd walked out of harder rooms than this one, because she'd built that walk deliberately over years and she wasn't going to let it slip now. She heard Ravenna say something behind her, a smoothing remark directed at the hall, something about difficult nights and the strength of the kingdom. She didn't hear the specific words. She was already in the corridor, and the corridor was empty, and she kept walking until she turned the corner and was out of the sightline of anyone who might be watching through the hall's main doors. Then she stopped. She pressed her back against the stone wall, and she breathed. The wall was cold through her gown's thin fabric. The corridor smelled of old stone and torch smoke, and the distant, layered scent of the festival behind her. She breathed in the cold. She counted it. Not a fragility she'd learned, but a discipline, the kind of deliberate deceleration that kept her functional in situations that wanted her irrational. Her mind was running calculations at a speed that felt almost disembodied. The scene in the garden, Kael's 8 months, Celine's hands moving to her abdomen, Ravenna standing up, not shocked, not scrambling, but ready, with a prepared argument that had the texture of something rehearsed. The way Ravenna had moved through the hall to reach the center before Evelina could continue speaking. The specific language she'd chosen, calling Evelina Baron before Evelina had used that word herself, which meant she knew what accusation she needed to diffuse and had preloaded the counter. She didn't scramble tonight, Evelina thought. She deployed. That meant Ravenna had known about the affair, not guessed. Known, and had known long enough to build a response to the exact scenario that had just occurred, which meant either someone had warned her that Evelina was approaching the garden, or she had anticipated this moment might come eventually and prepared for it anyway. Either possibility made the situation considerably worse than a betrayed wife and a weak husband. Something moved at the end of the corridor. She turned. The man walking toward her was not someone she'd expected to see at the Moon Festival. Darius Wolfe moved without sound, which was something she'd noticed about him years ago. Not stealth exactly, more the particular quality of a man who had spent enough time in dangerous places that silence had become structural. He was in his formal shadow guard attire, dark against dark, the commander's insignia at his collar. He was roughly Kael's age, 38 or 9, with a face that looked like something had tried to rearrange it several times and mostly failed. A scar ran from his left brow to his jaw. His eyes were the color of winter water. "Luna," he said. "Commander Wolfe." She steadied herself off the wall. "You're not usually at festivals." "I'm not usually needed at festivals." He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at her with the direct attention of someone who was deciding how much to say and had mostly decided. "I was on the upper level when you spoke. I heard everything. I expect most people did. I heard the Queen Mother, too." A pause. "I've heard her before. In context you might find relevant." Evelina studied him. Darius Wolfe had served the Crimson Fang Crown for 15 years, commanded the Shadow Guard for the last 6. He was not a political man in the way that courtiers were political. He operated in spaces the court didn't want to look at directly. Enforcement, intelligence, the border operations that required someone who could handle problems without documentation. He had a reputation for loyalty to the crown that had sometimes and quietly trumped loyalty to its individual occupants. She'd worked alongside him twice. She'd trusted him in the specific functional way you trusted a weapon, for what it was, not what it wasn't. 2 years ago, during the Greystone Pack ambush on the Northern Road, she had made a decision that saved his life. She'd done it because it was the right decision in that moment, without calculating return. He had looked at her afterward with an expression that suggested he wasn't accustomed to that calculus. "You owe me nothing," she said, because she believed it. "I'm aware," Darius said. "I'm here anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was still empty. Behind her, distantly, the festival music had started again. The show going on, the machine of the court consuming the evening's events and converting them into something manageable. "What contexts?" she said. He reached inside his jacket and removed a folded document. He held it for a moment without offering it, his eyes on her face. "Before I give you this," he said, "you need to understand what it means. This isn't a crisis you expose and walk away from. This becomes a war the moment you read it, and you will have very few people on your side for the first part of it." Evelina looked at the document, then at him. "What is it?" "Records," Darius said. "From the Shadowguard archive, sealed 8 years ago on the Queen Mother's authority." He paused. "Records that document what happened to King Aldrich Draven before he died." Kael's father, the late king. A death 9 years ago that had been attributed publicly to a blood sickness. Sudden, aggressive, untreatable. Mourned with appropriate ceremony. Succeeded by his son without political disruption, with Ravenna smoothly assuming the role of advisor and then gradually, functionally, something more than that. Evelina's hand reached out. She took the document, she unfolded it, and her eyes moved across the first page, tracking the old script, the formal administrative language of Shadow Guard record-keeping. Medical records. Correspondence. A detailed accounting of treatments administered and compounds used. And at the bottom of the third page, in a handwriting she did not recognize, a single annotated note with a date and a name. Compound source. Authorized by R. Draven. Purpose. Succession management. The corridor seemed to get colder. She looked up at Darius. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has handed someone a burning thing and is waiting to see if they'll drop it. She folded the document carefully. She held it against her chest. Outside, 300 wolves were eating and drinking and talking about what the Luna had said and what the Queen Mother had answered and what it meant for the kingdom's future. Kael was probably in the hall right now, being managed by his mother, the conversation already being reshaped into something the court could absorb without panic. Celine was probably somewhere quiet, terrified and waiting for instruction. And Ravenna Draven was in that hall, silver-haired and composed, drinking festival wine beside the throne of a kingdom she had spent a long time ensuring she controlled. "She poisoned him," Evelina said. Darius said nothing. He didn't need to. Evelina stood in the cold corridor with a document in her hands that made her a target, and made the woman who wanted to destroy her something she hadn't understood until this moment. Not a difficult mother-in-law, not a political opponent, but something far more dangerous. A woman who had already demonstrated what she was willing to do to protect her version of this kingdom. She thought about the 2 miscarriages. She thought about the compounds Ravenna had insisted on adding to her meals during both pregnancies, pressed with maternal warmth and elaborate explanation. She thought about the healer Ravenna had dismissed from the palace 3 years ago, right after that healer had asked Evelina a very specific question about her health that no one had asked before or since. The thought was not yet a conclusion. It was a shape in the dark, but it was a shape she was going to find the edges of. She looked at Darius Wolf. "I need 3 days," she said. "I need to understand exactly what's in these records before I move, and I need to know who else knows they exist." "2 people," Darius said. "The archivist who pulled them for me, who I trust with my life. And now you." "And you," she said. "And me." He held her gaze. "Luna, Evelina. What the Queen Mother said in there tonight was an opening move. She's been watching you for months. She knows you found out. She probably wanted you to find out, in that context, on that night, so she could execute the reframe in front of witnesses before you had time to prepare." He paused. "She's been planning your removal for longer than 8 months. The affair was the mechanism, not the goal." Evelina felt that land in her chest like something physical. "She needed Kael to produce an heir," she said slowly. "Not just any heir, a specific heir, through a woman she chose." Selena Voss's mother, Darius said, was Ravenna Draven's closest ally before she died. Celine has been under Ravenna's protection since she was 14. The full architecture of it assembled in front of Evelina like a structure she'd been walking through for years without understanding its shape. Not an affair, not a weakness, a selection. A replacement candidate chosen by the woman who ran this kingdom from its shadow. For the purpose of securing a succession she could control through a child whose mother owed her everything. And she, Evelina, the Luna, the woman who had organized the festival and held the border and managed the quarantine and ridden north at 22 with nothing but ambition and backbone, had been the problem the entire time. Not because she'd failed, because she'd succeeded. Because she'd become someone the court trusted independently of Kael, and that was the one thing Ravenna couldn't afford. She pressed the document harder against her chest. "She's not going to let this stay quiet," Evelina said. "No," Darius said. "She's going to move fast now. In my estimate, within the week." "Then so do I." She looked at him one more time. This man she had trusted in the functional way, the weapon trust, the earned and narrow thing. She understood that what she was about to ask would demand something more than that, from both of them. "Will you help me?" she said. Darius Wolfe looked at her for a long moment, at the document in her hands, at whatever he read in her face. Not desperation, she hoped, not grief. The thing that was harder and more useful than either. He said, "I already am." She turned toward the corridor that led to the private archive. She had 3 days. She was going to need all of them, because behind her, through the great hall's thick doors, she could hear Ravenna's voice rising over the festival crowd in that warm, carrying tone, and even through stone and distance, she could make out just enough to understand what was happening. The Queen Mother wasn't mourning the evening, she was owning it. And when Evelina paused at the corner to listen, really listen, straining against the noise, she heard Ravenna say clearly, with the easy authority of a woman announcing tomorrow's weather, "The Blood Moon Council will convene in 14 days. It is time this kingdom had the leadership it deserves." 14 days. Not weeks. Not the slow erosion Evelina had braced for. 14 days until Ravenna moved to strip her title in front of every alpha in the Allied territories and crown Celine Voss in her place. With a child in her womb and Ravenna's hand on her shoulder, and the court already half convinced that Evelina Blackthorne had failed at the one thing that mattered. Evelina turned and walked into the dark. She had the document. She had Darius. She had 14 days. And she had the one thing Ravenna had spent 8 months trying to make the court forget she possessed. The truth. All of it. Including the parts that were going to bury more than one person in that palace before this was finished. The private archive was 3 levels below the palace's main floor, carved into the bedrock during the kingdom's second expansion, back when the Draven line was still young enough to understand that power required hiding places. Evelina had been down here twice in 11 years. Both times on Kael's arm, both times for ceremonial record-keeping that required the Luna's witnessed signature. She knew the corridor's length. She knew the iron door at its end and the particular smell of the room beyond it. Old parchment and cold mineral air, and something faintly chemical that the archivists used to preserve documents against damp. She did not know, until tonight, that there was a second room. Darius led her past the main archive door, past the place where the torchlight normally ended, to a section of wall that looked identical to the 3 sections flanking it. He pressed 2 specific stones in a sequence that was too quick to memorize, and the wall moved. Not dramatically. A narrow seam opened, 3 feet wide, revealing steps going down another level. "How long have you known about this?" she said. 6 years. "Does Kael know?" "No." She filed that and followed him down. The lower room was smaller than the archive above. A single table, 2 chairs, a lamp that Darius lit from the torch he'd carried. The walls held shelving units packed with documents in sealed casings. The kind of preservation casing that indicated age and deliberate concealment rather than routine storage. Evelina set the document she'd been carrying on the table and spread it flat. Then she looked at Darius. "Show me everything." He pulled a casing from the 3rd shelf on the left. He knew exactly which one, which meant he'd been here before tonight, which meant this wasn't an impulse. He had been preparing for a moment that required her presence. She stored that too. Not suspicion exactly, more the habit of a woman who had learned that the timing of generosity was usually informative. He opened the casing and laid 4 documents beside the one she'd carried. She read. Darius stood across the table and let her read without interruption, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Most men in his position would have guided her through it, narrated it, used the information as a demonstration of their own intelligence. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched her face and said nothing. It took 20 minutes. When she finished, she placed her palm flat on the documents and looked at the wall. "He was healthy," she said. His physician's notes from the year prior described him as one of the strongest alphas in 3 generations, Darius said. No underlying conditions. No prior blood abnormalities. The compound used... She stopped. She pressed harder against the documents. It mimics blood sickness. It produces the same markers. Any healer treating him for the presenting symptoms would be treating the wrong disease. And the actual cause would be untraceable without knowing to look for it specifically. Who knew to look for it specifically? One man, Darius said. An independent physician from the Ashford territory who examined the late king's body at the request of Lord Ashfall, who had private doubts about the diagnosis. His report is in the second document. He paused. He died 4 months after submitting it, riding accident. Evelina turned that over, looked at it from multiple angles. Ravenna had him killed. I believe so. I cannot yet prove it. Yet, she said. Something in how she said it made Darius look at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not surprise, something more like recognition. The look of someone identifying a quality in another person that they'd suspected but needed confirmation of. The archivist who helped you pull these records, she said. Can I meet him? Her, and yes, tomorrow morning, if you can get to the lower kitchen before the household staff starts their rotation. She works the pre-dawn baking shift as cover. As cover, Evelina repeated. She's been working for you. She has been working for the kingdom, Darius said, which is not always the same thing as working for its king. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw unsteady light. His scar ran from brow to jaw, and in this light it looked carved rather than grown, something the years had set hard. He was watching her with the attention of a man who had decided something and was currently at peace with having decided it, which told her that whatever this was, his presence in this corridor, the archive, the timing, had not been casual. You've been building a case, she said. I've been maintaining one, he said. Building implies a destination. I wasn't sure what the destination was until tonight. What changed tonight? You walked into that hall and told 300 people the truth when you had every reason not to. A pause. Most people in your position would have found a private arrangement, negotiated something, accepted something, preserved appearances long enough to find an exit. He held her gaze. You didn't. That's not bravery, she said. That's refusal. I know, he said. That's why it matters. She gathered the documents and began returning them to their casing with the methodical care of someone who understood that physical order was sometimes the only kind available. Her hands were steady. She was aware of that. The steadiness of them. The way you become aware of a mechanism when it performs correctly under pressure. 14 days, she said. 13 now. Ravenna will move on my position immediately. She'll start with the servants. Anyone who might be loyal to me rather than the crown. Then the junior nobles, who are easiest to pressure. Then she'll approach the Alpha Council members individually before the blood moon, to soften the room before I can. She looked up. She'll also try to isolate me physically, restrict my movement through the palace under some pretext. She can't restrict the Luna's movement without Kael's explicit order. Kael will give it if she asks him to. Evelina heard the flatness in her own voice. Not bitterness, just the way certain sentences sounded when they stopped being assessments and became facts. He stayed silent tonight while she called me Baron in front of his court. He'll stay silent about this too, until it costs him something she can't compensate for. Darius didn't dispute it. Then we move before she expects movement, he said. She sealed the casing, set it back on its shelf, looked at it for a moment, sitting there in the dark between 30 years of hidden things. What else is in here? Enough, he said. We'll work through it systematically. Starting tomorrow. Starting now, he said. We have until the pre-dawn rotation when this level risks being noticed. That's roughly 4 hours. She looked at him, the lamp, the documents. The second room that Kael didn't know existed, buried under the palace he'd spent his life running. She pulled out the chair and sat down. Then we work, she said. They worked for 3 hours and 40 minutes. By the time they came back up through the hidden passage, Evelina had a picture that was simultaneously more complete and more sickening than what she'd carried down the steps. Ravenna Draven had not simply managed her husband's death, she had spent the following 9 years managing the kingdom's memory of him, quietly discrediting advisors who had been closest to Aldrich, easing out administrators who might have known too much, installing loyalists in positions adjacent to information control. The Shadowguard archive was the one place she hadn't fully penetrated, because penetrating it would have required confronting Darius Wolf directly. And Darius was the one person in the kingdom whose loyalty couldn't be purchased because he'd decided years ago what it was worth, and it wasn't for sale. What Evelina hadn't known, reading those documents, was that 2 of the 3 miscarriages her healers had attributed to natural causes had occurred during periods when Ravenna had been administering what she called supplemental tonics. Compounds provided through the palace kitchen. Compounds with ingredients that Evelina, who was not a healer, would not have known to question. She stood in the corridor above the hidden passage and breathed through her nose for a count of 5. Darius said nothing. He was giving her the silence, which cost him nothing and was exactly right. She said, "She took them from me." The words came out quiet. Not a question, not an accusation directed anywhere. A statement made to the stone corridor, to the dark, to whatever version of herself had carried those losses for years in the private, wordless way women carried the things they couldn't afford to put down in public. "We don't have confirmation on that yet," Darius said. "The documents suggest it. They don't prove it." "I know the difference," she said. "I'm not going to trial in this corridor." She exhaled, turned. "Get me the confirmation." He nodded once. The next morning, the palace felt different. It was the same building, same stone, same corridors, same servants moving through the same rotations with the same expressions. But Evelina moved through it now with a different orientation, the way a person moves through a familiar room after discovering there's a floor beneath the floor. Every interaction acquired a second layer. At breakfast, 2 servants who had attended her personally for 6 years were absent. Their duties had been reassigned overnight with no explanation offered. A junior steward she didn't recognize brought her tea. He was polite and entirely unfamiliar, and she thanked him and watched him leave and cataloged the message without reacting to it. Ravenna was thinning her staff. She'd expected it. That didn't make it feel like less of a violation. She was still at the table when the door opened and Kael came in. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. His eyes had the raw quality of someone who had spent the night inside a conversation with themselves that hadn't resolved. He was still in the clothes from the festival. He'd either slept in them or not slept at all. He closed the door behind him and stood near it, and the 12 feet of space between them felt considerably wider than that. Evelina. Kael. He crossed to the table, didn't sit, stood at its edge with his hands braced against the wood, and she waited without helping him because she wasn't going to carry this conversation on top of everything else she was currently carrying. "I need you to understand," he started. "No," she said. He stopped. "You don't need me to understand anything right now," she said. "You need to believe I'll understand so you can feel better about what you did. Those aren't the same thing, and I won't pretend they are." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to talk to you." "You were trying to protect a secret for 8 months. You weren't trying to talk to me." She set her tea down, looked at him with the level attention she'd used on recalcitrant nobles in 6 different trade negotiations. "What do you want, Kael? Specifically?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, like the weight of the night had finally found its natural position. He put his elbows on the table and pressed both hands over his face and stayed there for a moment. She watched. There was something real in that gesture, something that wasn't performance, wasn't the political Kael. It was the person underneath that, whoever he actually was, briefly visible through the exhaustion. She did not soften. She'd learned the hard way that the truest version of someone was not always their most sympathetic version. It was just the version without the management layer. "I didn't want this to happen this way," he said into his hands. "How did you want it to happen?" He dropped his hands, looked at her. "I don't know. I told myself I'd figure it out." "You told yourself you'd figure it out," she said, "for 8 months. I made a mistake." "You made a sequence of choices," she said, "every day for 8 months, each one built on the last. That's not a mistake, Kael. That's a direction." He held her gaze and she saw something move in him, an impulse toward anger because anger was familiar and defensible and easier than the alternative. She watched him decide against it. That was interesting. Under other circumstances, it might have meant something. My mother, he said. Don't, she said. She overstepped. She called me Baron in front of 300 witnesses, and you stood there, Evelina said. That's not overstepping. That's a choice you made by not making a different one. She leaned forward slightly. Did you know she'd planned what she said? Before last night. Did you know she had that ready? Something crossed his face, complicated and quick. She told me if you caused a scene, she'd handle it. The room seemed to contract slightly. She kept her breathing even. Handle it, she said. I didn't know what she meant by that. That's the problem, Cale. You never know what she means until after she means it. She stood, picked up her tea, walked to the window. Outside, the palace grounds were going through their morning rotations. Guards changing, grooms moving horses, the ordinary machinery of a kingdom starting its day over the wreckage of last night. You have been standing in rooms with that woman your entire life, and you have never once asked yourself what she is willing to do. She looked at the grounds. I've been asking myself that question for years. I finally have an answer. What does that mean? She turned. It means you should talk to her. Before the Blood Moon Council. Ask her what handling it means. Ask her what she's been doing while you were... She stopped, recalibrated, chose precision over feeling, occupied. He was watching her now with something that wasn't guilt anymore, something more alert. He was a perceptive man when he chose to be. That had always been the tragedy of him, the perceptiveness that sat unused because using it was inconvenient. What do you know? He said. Start with what you know, she said. Start with your mother. He sat with that. The morning light came through the window behind her and fell across the table between them, and none of it felt like warmth. She left him there. She moved through the next 3 days with the particular precision of someone who understood that visible stillness was the best cover for invisible motion. She ate at the appointed hours. She appeared at the minor court functions that were too small for Ravenna to engineer away. She spoke to servants and nobles with normal affect and absorbed, behind that effect, every shift in behavior and allegiance that was visible to someone paying close attention. Ravenna's campaign was fast and surgical. By the second day, 4 senior nobles had been seen entering the Queen Mother's private salon, the kind of visit that didn't appear on any official schedule. By the third day, 2 members of the Beta Council had found reasons to be publicly cool toward Evelina in corridor encounters, the deliberate micro-withdrawal of people who had been told which direction the current was flowing. She documented every shift without reacting to it. Reaction would cost her information. Stillness was a gathering instrument. On the 4th morning, she met the archivist. Her name was Petra. She was 62 years old, small and narrow-shouldered, with the permanently ink-stained fingers of someone who had spent decades handling documents, and the eyes of someone who had spent the same amount of time understanding what documents meant. She slid a folder across the kitchen table while kneading bread with her other hand, a piece of theater so practiced it was almost invisible. 3rd page, Petra said. The dates. Evelina opened the folder under the table's edge and looked at the 3rd page without removing it from the folder, a habit she'd developed in the last 4 days. The dates, the tonic administration records, the miscarriage dates. The alignment was not coincidental. It was precise, the kind of precision that required either extraordinary bad luck or deliberate calibration. How long have you had this? Evelina said. Long enough, Petra said. She shaped bread without looking up. I've been in this palace for 34 years. I was here before Ravenna. I knew what Aldrich was, and I know what she is. She paused her hands briefly. I stayed because leaving doesn't change what happened, and because files need keeping by someone who knows what they mean. You're the one who pulled Darius's records. I'm the one who made sure they were still there to pull. Petra looked at her for the first time, direct, unhurried. You have maybe 9 days before the Blood Moon. She already has 3 Alpha Council members. She needs 4 more for a binding vote on the Luna position. Who are the 4 she needs? Lord Vassar, who she's been cultivating for 2 years. Lord Kane, who owes her a favor that he'd prefer not made public. The Grey Wolf Alpha, Torin, who is new to the council and doesn't know the history. And Lord Aldrich Ashfall. She resumed the bread. Ashfall is the one she's least sure of, which is why she'll approach him last. Ashfall won't move against me, Evelina said. She'd worked with Hector Ashfall for 9 years. She knew his tells. He won't move against you, Petra agreed. But he might stay neutral. Neutral counts as her vote if she has the other 3. Evelina closed the folder, slid it back, looked at the bread on the table, the ordinary morning task of it, the way it sat in the kitchen alongside everything else that was being shaped by invisible hands. I need to speak to Lord Ashfall today. He takes his morning walk along the east rampart, Petra said, between 6th and 7th bell, alone. His habit for 20 years. She glanced up once more, brief and knowing. It would be a reasonable place to encounter him by coincidence. On the east rampart at 6:30 bell, with the wind coming in cold off the northern range and the kingdom spread below in its morning configuration, Evelina walked into Hector Ashfall, coming around the rampart's bend. He was 71 years old and built like something the mountains had been involved in. His white hair was cut short, and his face had the settled quality of a man who had made his major decisions decades ago and was no longer troubled by them. He stopped when he saw her, looked at her for a long moment. "Luna," he said. "Lord Ashfall," she said. "I'm glad I found you. I suspect coincidence had little to do with it." But his voice wasn't hostile. It was the dry flatness of a man who had operated in courts long enough to find the machinery somewhat amusing. "Walk with me." They walked. "She's going to approach you," Evelina said. No preamble, because he wouldn't want any. "She already did," he said. "Last evening. Long conversation. Good wine." He looked at the landscape below. "She has a version of events that is quite well constructed. I'll give her that." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd consider the matter carefully." He glanced sideways. She didn't care for that answer. She wanted a commitment. She wanted a certainty, he said. "She doesn't collect maybes." He was quiet for a moment. "Your physician, Solara, was dismissed 3 years ago. I noticed. I asked about it. Was told it was routine restructuring." He said it flatly, without drama, the way he'd say anything that was technically a question but actually an opening. "I know why she was dismissed," Evelina said. "I know what Solara found." Ashfall said nothing for several steps. She watched his profile. The settled quality of him was the same, but something underneath it had sharpened. "The physician who examined Aldrich," he said quietly. "The one I sent." "I've read his report," she said. 2 more steps. 3. The wind came off the north range with real teeth in it, and neither of them acknowledged it. "How much do you have?" he said. "Enough for a Blood Moon Council if you'll help me get it in front of the Alphas before Ravenna gets them in a room separately." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to take my side, Lord Ashfall. I'm asking you to make sure the whole picture gets seen. You've been trying to get that physician's report seen for 9 years. This is the opportunity." He looked at her for a long time. The wind moved between them. "The Blood Moon Council," he said. "She intends it as a removal." "I intend it as an exposure," Evelina said. "One of us is going to get there first." He studied her face. Then he looked back at the landscape below. The kingdom, the walls, the territory that had carried the Draven name for 3 generations, and the secrets of what that name had required. "I'll need to see the documents," he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Petra will know where." He nodded once, turned and resumed his walk. She stood at the rampart's edge and watched him go and felt the particular quality of a thing that had been in motion for years finally finding its velocity. She had 9 days. She had Darius, Petra, and now Ashfall. She had documents that were going to dismantle a queen. She turned from the rampart and found Kael standing at the tower door. He looked like he'd been there for a while. His face held the expression of a man who had taken her advice and spoken to his mother and found what she'd told him he would find. But the finding of it had done something different to him than she'd anticipated. He didn't look guilty now. He looked hollow. The particular hollowness of a person whose primary architecture has been revealed to be a construction. She waited. "She poisoned him," he said. His voice had no inflection in it. None. It was the voice of a sentence that had cost everything to say. "My father, she..." He stopped, started again. "I asked her. I didn't say what I knew, I just asked her to be straight with me for once, and she—" He exhaled through his nose. "She didn't deny it. She explained it. Like it was a management decision. Like it was policy." Evelina looked at him. At the man who had stayed silent while she was destroyed, and had spent 8 months building a replacement, and had let his mother call her Baron in a room full of witnesses. She looked at him, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not sympathy. Something colder and more complicated than that. The recognition that what he was holding right now was a real thing, a weight she understood the specific gravity of, and that it had broken something in him she doubted would repair. "What are you going to do?" she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you need me to do." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I need you to stay out of my way," she said, "until the Blood Moon Council. I need you to give me no reason to question whether you're a variable or a liability. Can you do that?" Something moved in his face, a flinch almost. But underneath it, and this was the piece she hadn't expected, the piece that was going to complicate everything, was something that looked like relief. Like being told exactly what was required was the first clean instruction he'd been given in years. "Yes," he said. She walked past him into the tower. She was 6 steps down the staircase when his voice came after her, quiet and final. "She told me Celine's child wasn't mine." Evelina stopped. She didn't turn around. "She arranged it from the start," Kael said from the doorway above. "The child, the paternity. She has a man. Someone she chose. She needed a child with a Draven bloodline claim that she controlled completely, and she's been—" His voice broke once, brief and brutal. "She's been falsifying the record since the beginning of Celine's pregnancy to make the timing fit." Evelina stood on the staircase and understood that the architecture had just grown another floor. Ravenna Draven hadn't just arranged a replacement Luna. She had arranged a replacement heir. One she had engineered from conception to install as the next generation of a throne that would never, in any meaningful sense, escape her hand. This was not a succession scheme. This was a dynasty. And there were 8 days left before the Blood Moon Council, and Evelina had 9 days' worth of moves left to make. And the woman she was going to have to walk into that council hall and destroy was someone who had been playing this particular game for 30 years without a single significant loss. She began walking down the stairs. There was no version of the next 8 days that didn't end with one of them completely broken. She intended it to be Ravenna, the 7 days before the blood moon moved the way bad things move, faster than preparation allowed and slower than endurance preferred. Evelina worked in the hours between midnight and the third bell of morning, when the palace's human traffic thinned to skeleton rotations and the corridors belonged to people with reasons to be invisible. She and Darius mapped the document sequence 3 times, organizing the evidence into an architecture that could survive interruption. Because if Ravenna managed to cut them off mid-presentation at the council, the material still needed to hold its shape. Every piece cross-referenced at least 2 others. Every claim had a document behind it and a witness capable of confirming the document's origin. Petra had been cataloging the archive for 34 years with exactly this contingency in mind, and the result was a case that had the density of something built by someone who understood they might not live to see it used. Lord Ashfall came to the lower kitchen on the second morning and read for 2 hours without speaking. When he finished, he sat with his hands flat on the table and breathed through his nose and looked at nothing visible in the room. Then he said, quietly and without drama, "Give me the council's seating arrangement." He was in before she'd finished handing it to him. Darius secured the Shadow Guard's loyalty in the particular way a man like Darius secured things, not through speeches or appeals, but through the accumulated weight of who he was and what he'd asked of them and never asked of them. The Shadow Guard had been his instrument for 6 years, and they knew the difference between serving the crown and serving whoever was wearing it. He briefed his senior commanders in pairs, in rotation, over 4 days, telling them only what they needed to know when they needed to know it. By the 5th day, the Guard's operational loyalty had quietly reoriented, not to Evelina, to the truth of what the documents contained. In Darius's view, that was the same thing. Kael stayed out of her way. She didn't know what it cost him, and she didn't ask. She saw him twice in the common corridor, moving through the palace with the carefully neutral expression of a man following instructions he'd given himself. Both times he looked at her with something she didn't have a word for. Not guilt, which she was accustomed to from him, but something rawer and more permanent, like a man standing in the rubble of a thing and only now beginning to understand the full original dimensions of what he'd broken. She didn't comfort him. She didn't have it to give. On the 6th day, 3 hours before she intended to review the final document sequence with Darius and Ashfall, Petra did not appear at the pre-dawn kitchen rotation. Evelina waited 12 minutes past the appointed time. Then she walked the long way to the archive level, through the servant corridors that avoided the main guard positions, and found the lower archive passage sealed. Not locked, which would have been ordinary, but sealed with a wax impression she didn't recognize bearing the Queen Mother's mark. She stood in the corridor and looked at that seal for 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked. She didn't run. Running was information. She walked at the pace of a woman with routine business, and her chest was doing something that required management. A cold, contracting sensation that was the body's version of the calculation her mind was already running. The seal meant Ravenna knew about the lower archive, which meant someone had told her, which meant the tight circle of 4, Evelina, Darius, Petra, Ashfall, had a fracture in it that she had not identified in time. She found Darius in the Shadow Guard's secondary post, a room off the barracks that functioned as his actual office rather than the ceremonial one near the throne room. He was standing when she came in, which told her he already knew something was wrong. His senior commander, Bren, was with him, a compact, weathered man of 50 who had the look of someone who had just delivered information he wasn't pleased to be carrying. "The archive," she said. "Sealed an hour ago," Darius said, "on the Queen Mother's authority, citing security concerns about the lower level's structural integrity." He held her gaze. "It's a pretext." "I know it's a pretext." She stopped in the center of the room. "Where is Petra?" Bren answered. "Escorted to the East guest quarters under house restriction. Ravenna's people are calling it a health matter." Evelina looked at the wall. The cold, contracting sensation in her chest was still happening, and she was still managing it, counting it as information rather than feeling, because feeling it fully right now would consume time she didn't have, and processing it would have to happen later in a room without witnesses, the way she processed everything that mattered. Someone had told Ravenna about the archive, about Petra, about what they had. She looked at Darius. "Who knew the full scope of what we were building?" "You, me, Petra, Ashfall," he said. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was working through something he was angry about but containing. "And Kael." The room shifted slightly. She heard it before she thought it. The specific quality of silence when a name lands in a space and fills it with implications the room wasn't built to hold. "Kael," she said. "You told him on the rampart," Darius said. Not an accusation, a reconstruction. "The nature of what you had, what you intended for the Blood Moon Council." She replayed the rampart conversation, what she'd said, what she hadn't said. She had not told Kael about the archive specifically, but she had told him the documents existed, that she was going to the council with them, that Ashfall was involved. She had told him enough that a conversation with Ravenna would have given his mother sufficient direction. He said he'd stay out of her way. He had said it with relief in his face, the kind of relief she'd read as a man grateful for clear instruction. She had read it wrong, or perhaps she hadn't read it wrong exactly, but she had read only half of it. The relief of a man given clear instruction. The instruction Ravenna had given him first. She thought of him on the rampart. His face. The hollowness. The broken quality of a man who had just learned what his mother was. He had believed that moment. She had believed it with the part of her that was still, after everything, calibrated to recognize genuine grief. She had been right that his grief was genuine. She had been wrong about which direction it pointed. He had not gone to Ravenna to betray her. He had gone to Ravenna because he was the man he'd always been, the man who needed managing, who needed his mother to tell him how to hold something before he could hold it. He had gone to Ravenna in his grief, the way he'd gone to her his entire life. And Ravenna had taken that grief and turned it into a tool the way she turned everything into a tool. And Kael had let it happen because letting it happen was the only thing he'd ever truly mastered. She had known this about him. She had known it for years. She had trusted him anyway. Not because she was foolish, because she had needed to believe that the man she'd built 11 years beside had enough of himself left to stand in one corner when she asked him to stand there. The grief was real. It moved through her chest in a single, clean wave, and then it was past. Not gone, but stored, the way a wound gets stored when you're still on the field that made it. "How much did we lose?" she said. "The archive is sealed, but not destroyed," Darius said. "Ravenna doesn't know everything we copied. We have physical copies of the 14 most critical documents. They're not in the archive." "Where are they?" "Bren's custody, 3 separate locations." He paused. "We still have enough." "We have enough if we get into that council chamber," she said. "She sealed the archive to shake us, to make us think we lost more than we did. She wants us to walk into the blood moon tomorrow either empty-handed or rattled enough to make mistakes." She looked between Darius and Bren. "Is Ashfall still secure?" "I spoke to him an hour ago," Darius said. "He's holding. Ravenna will approach him today. A final approach, harder than the first. She needs his vote or his silence, and she's running out of time to get either." She pressed her knuckle briefly against her lower lip, a thinking gesture, private and unconscious. "Who has she confirmed on the council?" "Vassar, Kane, and Grey Wolf," Bren said. 3 of 7. She needs 4 to bind the vote. "She's going to try for Ashfall, and she's going to try for Marrow," Evelina said. "Lord Marrow of the Western Pack, she'd read him wrong at first, taken his neutrality as independence, but 3 days ago she'd noticed the particular way he'd avoided her eye in council antechamber. That was the behavior of a man who had already made a decision he was ashamed of." "I may have already lost Marrow." Darius looked at her. "If she gets Marrow and Ashfall, she doesn't need the count. She has it." "I know," Evelina said. The room was quiet for a moment. Bren looked at the floor with the expression of a military man confronting a tactical situation he doesn't like and intends to solve anyway. Darius looked at Evelina with the steady attention he always gave her. Not the attention of someone waiting to be told what to do, but someone thinking alongside. She thought about the 14 documents, about what they contained and what they proved, and what the 12 people sitting in the Blood Moon Council Hall tomorrow would do when that proof was presented to them. She thought about Ravenna standing in the Grand Hall 8 days ago, silver-haired and precise, with a prepared speech and 30 years of political capital behind it. She thought about the man on the rampart who had looked broken, and possibly was, but broken in the direction of his mother, the way he'd always broken. She thought about the 2 miscarriages. She let herself think about them fully, for the first time without the management layer, because she needed the anger. Not the grief, the anger. The grief was going to stay stored until this was over. The anger was going to be a different kind of instrument. "I need to do something tonight that I haven't done in 11 years, she said. Darius waited. "I need to talk to the council members myself, individually. Tonight, before Ravenna makes her approach." She looked at him. Not as Luna, not as the woman defending her position, as the person who has what they need to understand what they're being asked to ratify tomorrow. "Vassar and Kane are already committed to her," Darius said. "I'm not going to Vassar and Kane," she said. "Grey Wolf is new. He doesn't know the history. If he understands what he's voting on, not Ravenna's version of it, but the actual material, he might hold." She paused. "And I'm going to Marrow." "You think you can pull Marrow back?" "I think Marrow is ashamed," she said. "Shame is a door. You just have to knock on it before someone else locks it from the other side." Bren looked up. "That's 6 separate meetings, tonight, without Ravenna's people tracking your movements. That's why I need the Shadow Guard's route knowledge," she said, "and why I need to start in the next 2 hours." She found Lord Grey Wolf in the East Wing's visiting quarters, a young alpha, 30 at most, with the unsettled manner of a man operating in a political environment considerably more complex than the pack he'd grown up commanding. He answered her knock with the guarded expression of someone who'd been told to be careful. She told him nothing he wasn't already half suspecting. She placed 3 documents on his table, gave him 20 minutes to read them, and asked him one question. Was he prepared to vote for the removal of Aluna based on a case built on falsified information by the same woman who had murdered the previous king? He didn't answer immediately. She didn't ask him to. She left him with the documents and his own conscience and moved to the next door. Lord Marrow was harder. He was 58, a practical man who had spent his career calculating the cost of the wrong affiliation, and he had the armored quality of someone who had committed to a position and was bracing against the discomfort of it. She didn't bring documents to Marrow. She sat across from him in the corridor alcove outside his quarters, and she looked at him directly and said, "Tell me what she offered you." He went rigid. "I'm not here to expose it," she said. "I'm here because I think you're a man who made a practical decision and is now beginning to understand the fuller weight of what you decided to be practical about." She held his gaze. "The physician who examined Aldrich Draven 9 years ago and submitted a report questioning the diagnosis of his death. He was riding home when his horse threw him. He had been a skilled rider for 40 years. She paused. "That's the woman whose position you're being asked to protect tomorrow." Marrow looked at the wall for a long time. His face was doing something difficult and private. She let it do it. She didn't push. "If I change my position," he said quietly, "she'll know it was you." "She'll know anyway," Evelina said. "The question isn't whether she knows. The question is whether you can look at a man who's been dead for 9 years and tell him you had the chance to matter and you chose not to." She left him there. She was walking back through the inner corridor 3 hours before midnight when she felt the shift in the palace the way wolves felt weather, before it was visible, in some register below conscious processing. A change in the ambient sound, the particular quality of rapid movement in spaces that were supposed to be quiet. She stopped. Bren appeared at the corridor's end. His face was the controlled face of a man delivering information at controlled pace, because pace mattered and panic did not help. He reached her and dropped his voice to something that carried 2 feet and no further. "The East Wing," he said. "Ravenna moved on Ashfall 20 minutes ago, not a conversation. A formal summons in front of witnesses framed as a loyalty inquiry. She's holding him in the Queen Mother's salon." Evelina felt the cold contraction again. "On what basis?" "She's claiming he's been conspiring with you against the crown." Bren's jaw was tight. "She's not waiting for the council. She's moving tonight to pull Ashfall's council seat entirely and replace him with a proxy she can direct." "She can't pull a council seat without—" She stopped. Thought. "She needs Kael's authority for that." "She has it," Bren said. "Kael signed the order an hour ago." The corridor seemed very quiet. Evelina stood in it and let herself fully understand the shape of the night. Ashfall detained. His council seat potentially stripped before the blood moon. The archives sealed. Petra under house restriction. Kael, who had stood on the rampart and said whatever you need me to do, signing orders at his mother's direction within 24 hours of that conversation. She thought about what it meant to build something on a foundation you hadn't adequately tested. To trust the tested parts and assume the untested parts would hold because the tested parts had held. That was not wisdom. That was hope dressed as strategy. She had been doing something that she would not do again, choosing to believe something because believing it was easier than accepting the full cost of not believing it. The cost was Ashfall in a detention salon. The cost was a council seat disappearing overnight. The cost was tomorrow morning arriving with fewer allies than she'd entered the night expecting to have. She looked at Bren. "Get Darius," she said. "Now." Darius arrived in 4 minutes. She told him in 30 seconds. He listened with the stillness of a man for whom bad information was operational data and nothing else. "If she strips Ashfall's seat," he said, "and seats a proxy, she has the votes before anyone walks into that hall." "Yes." "Which means the council presentation doesn't happen the way we planned it." "No," she said, "it doesn't." He looked at her. The corridor was dark between the torch brackets, and his face in the low light had the quality of a man who was arriving at the same conclusion she'd arrived at 30 seconds earlier and was waiting to see if she'd say it first. "I'm not waiting for the council," she said. "The documents need a witnessed form to be binding," he said. Careful. Not resistant. Testing the shape of what she was proposing. "Then I need a witnessed form that Ravenna can't strip the participants from in the next 12 hours. She looked at him. "Who are the Alpha representatives from the Allied territories that arrived for the Moon Festival and haven't left yet?" Darius thought for 3 seconds. 6, including Torin of Grey Wolf, who you've already spoken to. Lord Ashfall's second, his beta deputy, who has council observer status, and 3 senior alphas from the northern and eastern packs who are still in residence. That's not the Blood Moon Council, she said. That's better. That's a witness assembly that Ravenna didn't convene and can't dissolve. She held his gaze. Can you get them in one room in the next 2 hours without routing through any channel she monitors? He was quiet for one moment. Yes, he said. The Shadow Guard's common hall. I can lock it from the inside. She thought about what she was choosing. The council presentation she'd prepared had been designed as a legal proceeding, formal, witnessed, binding by treaty obligation. What she was about to do instead was rawer than that. An emergency assembly convened outside normal channels, with documentation that hadn't been officially entered into the council record. Ravenna would call it irregular. She would contest its validity. She would spend the next week attempting to invalidate everything that happened in that room. But the alphas who witnessed it would know. The truth, once it entered a room and was read aloud and witnessed by people capable of understanding its implications, did not unenter. Ravenna could contest procedure. She could not contest the specific gravity of what those documents contained once it had been seen. Do it, Evelina said. Darius moved. She stood in the corridor alone for one moment before following him. Outside the palace walls, the blood moon was rising. She could feel it in the way wolves felt the moon, as a pressure in the chest and a heightening of everything, senses sharpened past comfort. Tomorrow had been the plan. Tonight was what remained. She had built this on careful architecture, and the architecture had been infiltrated. The documents were still real. The truth was still intact. But the version of herself that had organized this like a legal proceeding, with proper sequencing and proper witnesses, and the procedural protections of a formal council, was going to have to step aside. What was going to walk into that common hall tonight was something she had not been since the day she rode north at 22, with nothing but ambition and backbone. Not a Luna, not a strategist, not a woman working through channels that had been built by the people she was fighting. Something older than the title. Something that had survived 2 losses it was never allowed to grieve, and 11 years of holding a kingdom's surface together with her bare hands, and one betrayal layered under another until the floor itself had given way. She walked toward the Shadow Guard's common hall. Behind her, distantly, she heard the sound of doors opening in the Queen Mother's wing. The particular acoustic signature of Ravenna Draven setting the next morning's events in motion, already certain of what tomorrow would bring. She did not know that tomorrow had already been cancelled. The Shadow Guard's common hall held 30 men at capacity. Tonight it held 9, which was enough. Darius had moved fast and quiet, the specific competence of a man who had spent 15 years building relationships in spaces courts didn't watch. The 6 alpha representatives were present. Torrin of Grey Wolf, Lord Ashfall's beta deputy Cormac, and 3 senior alphas from the northern and eastern packs, whose names Evelina had known for years through correspondence and formal counsel, and whose faces she was seeing now in the low torchlight of a room that smelled like weapon oil and old wood. Bren stood at the door. Darius stood to her left. She put the 14 documents on the table. She did not introduce them. She did not build toward them with diplomatic framing or political preamble. She looked at the 9 men in the room and said, I have 1 hour before Ravenna Draven realizes this meeting is happening. What you read in that hour will determine what you do tomorrow. I'm asking you to read it. Torrin of Grey Wolf, young, cautious, who had listened to her in the East Quarters with the careful attention of a man not yet sure which way the ground was tilting, picked up the first document. The room read. She stood and let them read and watched their faces do the work that faces did when documents removed the possibility of comfortable ambiguity. Cormac went very still around the 4th page. The tonic records, the miscarriage dates, the alignment that was too precise for coincidence. One of the northern alphas, a broad-shouldered man named Fells, who had the weathered calm of someone who had survived 3 territory disputes without losing ground, set his document down after the 3rd and looked at the wall for a long moment before picking it back up. Torrin read everything twice. His jaw was set the 2nd time in a way it hadn't been the 1st. Nobody spoke for 40 minutes. When Fells finally broke the silence, his voice had the quality of a man who had decided something irrevocable and was simply announcing it. This is a patricide case. Yes, Evelina said, And the heir. Fabricated. The child's parentage was arranged by Ravenna. The records were falsified to establish a Draven bloodline claim she could control. The room absorbed that. Torin leaned back in his chair and pressed both hands over his face, a gesture she'd seen Kael make less than 48 hours ago, and that registered somewhere private and complicated. The Northern Alpha, to Torin's right, an older man, Ket, who had said nothing and whose silence had the weight of something being constructed methodically, looked at Darius. "The Shadowguard archive," Ket said. "This material came from there." "Yes," Darius said. "She sealed it." "She sealed it after we copied what you're holding." Ket looked at the documents in his hands, then at Evelina. "You built this in 9 days." "8, she said. "I had 9. I lost 1. Something moved in Ket's face. Not admiration exactly, something more functional than that. The recognition a soldier gave another soldier when they'd seen the conditions of a campaign and recalculated their estimate of the person who'd run it. "What do you need from us?" Fells said. "Witness signatures on the document testimony," she said. "Formal attestation that you've reviewed this material and consider it credible. That gives it the legal standing of a council-witnessed presentation even outside the official session." She looked around the room. "And I need your physical presence in the Blood Moon Council Hall tomorrow, regardless of what Ravenna does tonight to restructure the seating." "She stripped Ashfall's seat," Cormac said. He said it with the flat bitterness of a man who had served Hector Ashfall for 20 years and was using control to keep the bitterness from becoming something louder. "She's attempted to strip it," Evelina said. "A council seat established by treaty requires the consent of the territory's senior alpha representative, which is Cormac in Ashfall's absence. Cormac hasn't consented." She looked at him. "Have you?" "No," Cormac said. The word came out short and hard as struck iron. "Then the seat stands," she said. "She can argue otherwise tomorrow. She'll be arguing it in front of people who have read those documents. That changes the argument." They signed. Not ceremonially. There was nothing ceremonial about this room or this hour. They signed the testimony attestation with the practicality of people doing a necessary thing under pressure, and Bren witnessed each signature, and by the time it was done, the torches had burned a full inch lower, and the hour Evelina had estimated was inside its final minutes. She gathered the documents. Darius was already at the door. "One more thing," Torin said. She looked at him. "Ashfall," he said. "She's holding him in the salon as a loyalty detainee. That's illegal under the Allied Territory Compact without formal charges filed with the Council." He paused. "If she's holding him illegally, the Shadowguard has the authority to remove him from detention." She looked at Darius. Darius looked at her with the expression of a man who had known this was the logical next step and had been waiting to see if she'd arrive at it. "Can you do it without triggering an open confrontation with the Palace Guard?" she said. "Probably not," he said, "but I can do it fast enough that the confrontation doesn't matter." She thought about fast enough. She thought about what an open confrontation between the Shadow Guard and the Palace Guard meant for tomorrow. The optics of it, the way Ravenna would characterize it, the narrative she'd build around the disorder. She thought about Ashfall sitting in a salon under house restriction, 71 years old, and the man who had sent a physician to examine a dead king 9 years ago because something had seemed wrong and he'd been unwilling to let wrong things stay unexamined. She thought about what it cost to be that man for 9 years, carrying a dead physician and a sealed report, and the particular loneliness of knowing something that couldn't be safely known. "Do it," she said. The next 40 minutes were the most dangerous of the night, and they moved with the quality that dangerous things had when they were well executed. Not smoothly, because nothing in reality moved smoothly, but with the particular controlled violence of people who knew exactly what they were doing and refused to be deterred by the complications that arose. Darius took 6 Shadow Guard operatives through the palace's East Service corridor, the route that bypassed the main guard rotation, to the Queen Mother's salon wing. The palace guard at the salon entrance numbered 4. 2 of them stood down when they understood who they were facing. One did not, and ended up against the wall with Darius's forearm across his collarbone, not hurt but contained, and the 4th made the pragmatic decision that his loyalty had limits, that did not include being the last man standing in a confrontation with the Shadow Guard commander. Ashfall came out of the salon on his own feet, which was the first thing Evelina saw when he appeared in the corridor. The upright stubbornness of a man who had refused to be diminished by the room they'd put him in. He looked at her with the settled quality she'd always known from him and said, with complete dryness, "Took you long enough." "I was busy," she said. They moved. The palace's middle hour had a specific character, that deep night stillness where the building's pretenses dropped, and you could see it for what it actually was: stone and corridors, and the accumulated weight of the people who had moved through it, and the choices those people had made. Evelina moved through that stillness with Darius on her left and Ashfall on her right, and the 14 documents pressed against her chest, and the feeling of a woman who has been compressed for long enough that the compression itself had become structural, a load-bearing thing, and what was going to happen now was not its release but its deployment. She was not the same person who had stood in a garden 6 weeks ago and smelled a lie on the festival air. She could feel the distance between those two versions of herself, not as loss but as information. The woman in the garden had been operating with a model of her world that still contained the possibility of a Kael who would choose her, a Ravana who could be exposed and would fall by the simple weight of what she'd done, a court that would recognize justice when it was presented clearly. What she understood now, moving through the palace's dark middle hour with evidence in her hands and borrowed time on the clock, was that justice was not a thing that arrived. It was a thing you built, piece by piece, in the hours when no one was watching, out of materials that kept getting taken from you, and you built it anyway because the alternative was being the person who decided it wasn't worth building. That was not a philosophy she would have articulated. She didn't operate in articulations. But it was the thing living in her chest right now alongside the adrenaline, informing every decision at a register below language. She had nothing left to lose that she hadn't already been losing for years. That was not despair. That was the cleanest kind of freedom a person could arrive at, when the things you'd been protecting were already gone, and what remained was just the truth and the willingness to carry it into a room. She turned the corner toward the private chambers and stopped. Celine Voss was standing in the corridor, not strategically. She wasn't positioned or prepared. She was standing the way someone stood when they'd been pacing and happened to stop at the moment a door opened. She was in a plain nightrobe, her dark hair loose, and without the formal attire of their previous encounters, she looked her actual age, which was 24, and the 24 of it was visible in the particular quality of her fear. Not the calculated fear of a political operator, but the raw fear of a young woman who had been placed in a machine she hadn't fully understood and was now watching the machine's gears beginning to catch each other. Her eyes went to Evelina, then to the documents, then to Darius, then back to Evelina. "I need to tell you something," Celine said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Not performance. Evelina had spent 11 years reading courts, and she could see the difference between a calculated appeal and a person at the end of something. "Then tell it," Evelina said. "She told me it was Kael's child," Celine said. "From the beginning. She told me. She arranged everything, and she told me it was his. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago." Her hands were pressed flat against her abdomen in the gesture Evelina had first noticed in the garden. "When I found out the truth, she told me if I said anything, she'd take the child from me the moment it was born. She said she'd done it before." She looked at Evelina directly. "She said she'd done it to you." The corridor was very still. Evelina looked at Celine Voss, this young woman who had been a mechanism in a plan she hadn't designed and possibly hadn't consented to in any meaningful sense, and felt the complexity of a situation that refused to organize itself into the simple shape of villain and victim. Celine had made choices. She had also been 19 years old when Rowena Draven had begun cultivating her as a long-term instrument, which meant she had been a project before she was a person in this particular story. "Will you say this in the council hall tomorrow?" Evelina said. Celine's hands pressed harder against her abdomen. The fear in her face was the specific fear of someone calculating a cost they weren't sure they could afford. "She'll destroy me," Celine said. "Yes," Evelina said, "she'll try." She didn't offer comfort. She didn't soften the calculation. She had learned in the last 8 days that false comfort was a form of disrespect. It assumed the person receiving it couldn't handle the actual shape of things, and Celine had been handling the actual shape of things alone, in silence, in a palace where the woman managing her was 30 years and several murders ahead of her in the game. "You won't be alone in that room," Evelina said. "That's what I can offer you. It's not nothing." Celine looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the small, definitive nod of a person who has decided and is afraid of the decision and is going to do it anyway because the alternative has become unlivable. Evelina moved on. The rest of the night was architecture, some positions arranged, routes confirmed, documents secured in 3 separate locations against the possibility of a last-minute seizure. Ashfall and Cormac worked through the treaty language around council seating until Cormac had a legal argument so tight it would take a better lawyer than anyone Ravenna had on retainer to crack it in the time remaining. Darius briefed the Shadow Guard's full operational complement at the 3rd bell of morning, quietly and completely, because whatever happened in the council hall in a few hours' time had the potential to require physical management, and he intended his people to know exactly which authority they were serving when it did. Evelina didn't sleep. She sat with the documents in the small hours and read them one final time, not for new information, but for the particular purpose of knowing the material so thoroughly that no interruption, no misdirection, no parliamentary maneuver by Ravenna's faction could knock her off the sequence. She read until the documents stopped being documents and became something she carried internally, a structure she could reconstruct in any order from any point regardless of what was thrown at her. At the 5th bell, Kael came to her door. She opened it because she had decided that whatever he was, complicated, compromised, broken, in the direction of his mother, he was going to watch what happened today, and there was a version of what he witnessed that might do something to him. She wasn't counting on it. She wasn't building anything around it. But she opened the door. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had been sitting with things that didn't have comfortable corners. He looked at her, and he looked at the documents on the table, and he looked at the controlled preparedness of a woman who had spent the night building something instead of grieving. "She's mobilizing the palace council this morning," he said. "She told me at the 4th bell. She intends to have Ashfall's seat formally vacated before the council session begins." He paused. "I refuse to sign the second order." Evelina looked at him. "Why?" It was not a gentle question. It was a precise one, asking for the specific architecture of his decision rather than its emotional weather. "Because I found out what she did to the pregnancies," he said. "Petra told me, before Ravenna's people got to her." His voice had the particular flatness of someone operating below the register of normal emotion, because normal emotion had been temporarily overwhelmed, and what remained was something quieter and more fundamental. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it. I need you to know that I didn't know." "It doesn't change what happened," she said. "No," he said, "I know it doesn't." They looked at each other across the doorway. 11 years and a garden, and 8 months of a different direction, and everything that had been lost before that. The specific losses they had never been able to talk about properly, because talking about them properly would have required a version of their marriage that hadn't existed. She looked at him, and she felt something that was not love exactly, and not its absence either. It was the particular weight of knowing a person too well to simplify them, and being required by circumstances to set that weight down and move without it. "If you want to do something," she said, "be in that hall when the session opens. Stand where the council can see you. Don't speak, just be seen." "That's all," he said. "That's enough," she said. "Today." She closed the door. She dressed in the dark green of her official Luna attire, not the ceremonial gown, not the festival dress, but the working formal. The one she wore to treaty signings and court sessions. The one that said she was here in her function, not her feeling. She braided her hair back hard against her skull. She looked at herself in the glass for 4 seconds. The practice of a woman who had learned to check her external presentation the way a soldier checked armor, not for vanity, but for information about what the room would see before she could speak. What she saw was a woman who had been through a significant number of things and had not been broken by them. That was sufficient. At the 6th bell, she walked toward the Blood Moon Council Hall, with the 14 documents under her arm, and Darius 3 steps behind her, and Ashfall falling into pace on her right. The hall's great doors were already open. Inside, the council chamber held its 12 seats in the formal semicircle, 6 on each side of the central floor, the presentation dais at the room's apex, the alpha gallery along the upper tier where non-council alphas could observe proceedings. The gallery was already filling. The 9 men from last night were there, and others who had heard the 5th bell whispers that moved through any palace where something significant was imminent, and the room had the quality of a space that understood something was about to happen and was not yet sure what shape it would take. Ravenna was already seated. Not at the council table. The Queen Mother held no formal council seat. She sat in the advisor's chair at the chamber's side wall, silver-haired and precise, in a gray gown the color of institutional certainty. Her eyes found Evelina immediately. For a moment, across the length of the chamber, they simply looked at each other. Ravenna's expression did not change. That was the thing about 30 years of managing a kingdom from the shade. It produced a face that had become genuinely difficult to read, not because the person behind it was empty, but because they had learned to make themselves illegible. She looked at Evelina, and she looked at the documents, and she looked at Ashfall, walking into a hall where his seat was supposed to have been vacated. Something moved in her face. Not fear. Something Evelina recognized as more dangerous than fear. The expression of someone recalculating, which meant Ravenna had not fully anticipated this configuration and was adjusting, which meant she was still dangerous, still operational, still 3 moves ahead in a game she'd been playing since before Evelina had been born. Evelina walked to the presentation dais. She set the documents on the surface. She looked at the council seats, Vassar and Kane already seated, their faces carefully composed. Grey Wolf's Tauren in a seat, his jaw set. Marrow, who met her eyes briefly and then looked at the table. She looked at the empty seat that Ravenna had tried to vacate and watched Cormac walk to it and sit down in it with the deliberate unhaste of a man who had checked the treaty language 6 times and was certain of his ground. Ravenna's hand moved, a small gesture to the aide at her shoulder. The aide bent to receive a whispered instruction. At the far end of the room, the great doors began to move. Not closing. The palace guard detachment beginning to seal the chamber, restricting entry, which was the first mechanism of Ravenna's adjustment. If the doors closed before the proceedings were formally opened, the session could be called on Ravenna's terms, rather than the council's standing procedure. Evelina looked at Darius. He was already moving, placing the full weight of the Shadow Guard's present personnel against the inside of those doors. Not a fight, not yet, but a physical fact that the palace guard on the other side would have to decide whether to escalate against. The chamber held its breath. 12 council seats. The gallery above filling with alphas who had read documents in a common hall 4 hours ago. Ravenna in her advisor's chair with 30 years of this kingdom's hidden architecture behind her eyes. Kael, who had just walked through the side entrance and taken a position along the wall where the council could see him. Standing, not seated, exactly as she'd asked. Celine, who had not yet appeared but whose absence in the chamber had a different quality than a simple absence. And Evelina at the presentation dais with 14 documents that told the truth about the last 30 years of the Crimson Fang Kingdom in terms so specific and so documented that the only way to stop them from being heard was to physically remove the person holding them. She looked at Ravenna. Ravenna looked at her. The doors held. Evelina opened the first document. "My name is Evelina Blackthorne," she said, and her voice filled the chamber with the particular quality of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose and had decided to use that fact precisely and completely. "I have held the title of Luna of the Crimson Fang Kingdom for 11 years. I was called Baron before this court. I was called a woman who failed her king. I was told to step aside with gratitude for the years I was permitted to stand beside a throne that I helped build." She looked at the council, then at the gallery, then, last, at Ravenna. "This morning I am going to show you what was done to this kingdom, and I am going to show you who did it, and then this court is going to make a decision about what it is." She placed the first document facing outward toward the council seats. Ravenna stood. "This session," Ravenna said, her voice carrying the full weight of its practiced authority, "has not been formally—" "Lord Fells," Evelina said. The Northern Alpha in the gallery stood. This session is formally convened under Emergency Witness Assembly Provision, Treaty Article 9, with 6 Alpha representative signatures filed as of the 4th bell this morning. He held up the attestation document. The session is open. Ravena's face did the thing that faces did when 30 years of certainty encountered the specific configuration they had failed to plan for. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, in the particular controlled violence of a room full of powerful people simultaneously releasing the breath they had all been holding, voices overlapping, chairs moving, Vassar and Kane both starting to speak at once, and then stopping because what was the point of speaking when the gallery was already reading the documents being passed hand to hand, when Marrow had just stood up and moved to the opposite side of the chamber from where Ravenna was sitting, when Celine Voss was walking through the side door in plain dress, with her hands folded over her abdomen, and the specific expression of someone who had decided the cost was acceptable. Ravenna looked at Celine. Something happened in her face then that Evelina had not seen from her before. Not the recalculation, not the managed composure, but something underneath both of those, something that was the actual Ravenna, the person who had been running a 30-year project in the dark and was now watching it come apart in a room full of witnesses. It looked for 3 seconds like a person. Then it locked back up. "This is a fabrication," Ravenna said, loud, controlled, directing it at the gallery because the council was already reading and the gallery was the room she could still work. "This woman has spent 11 years resentful of a king she could not satisfy, and she has spent the last 9 days building a fiction to disguise her own failures." "Ravenna," Kael's voice. From the wall where he was standing, the room went quiet. He pushed off the wall and walked to the center of the chamber and stood there in the specific way of a man who had made a decision in the last several hours that was going to cost him everything and had decided the cost was the point. He looked at his mother. "Stop," he said. Just that word. With the particular weight of a son who had spent 40 years being managed and had, in the last 48 hours, finally understood the full dimensions of what that management had cost. Ravenna looked at him. What moved in her face was complicated. She had known him for 38 years, had shaped him, had arranged the architecture of his entire life, and he was standing in the center of a council chamber telling her to stop. For 3 seconds, the entire room was the space between those two people. Then Evelina said, "Document 7, page 3, and turned to the council, and began. She spoke for 40 minutes, not with passion. Passion was what people reach for when their evidence was thin. She spoke with precision, moving through the documents in the sequence she had memorized in the small hours of the morning, presenting each piece in relation to the one before it. So the architecture of what Ravenna had built was visible not just as individual crimes, but as a system. A 30-year system with a single organizing principle. That this kingdom and everything in it, including its king, including its Luna, including its heirs and its alliances and its dead, belonged to Ravenna Draven's vision of what it should be. Document 7 was the physician's report on Aldrich's death, cross-referenced with the compound records from the Shadowguard archive. Document 8 was the correspondence between Ravenna and the physician's employer in the months before the riding accident. Document 9 was the tonic administration log, dates, compounds, the handwriting that Petra had matched to the palace pharmacy requisitions that bore Ravenna's authorization mark. Documents 10 through 14 were the fabricated paternity records, the correspondence arranging Celine's placement in the palace years before the affair began, and the financial records showing payments to the man whose child Celine actually carried. The council read as she presented. The gallery was silent in the way rooms went silent when the information in them became too heavy for ambient noise. Ravenna sat in her advisor's chair and said nothing after Kael had told her to stop. That was the most frightening thing about her, the ability to absorb a significant tactical reversal and simply hold still inside it, recalibrating, looking for the remaining angle. Even now, with the documents in circulation and Celine standing along the side wall and Kael in the center of the chamber, she had not broken. She sat with the composed stillness of a woman who had survived 30 years of dangerous situations by refusing to perform collapse. When Evelina finished, the chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then Ket of the Northern Pack from the gallery said, I move that the witness assembly findings be entered into the formal council record under emergency provision. Seconded, Fells said. Vassar started to speak. The objection already formed, the procedural argument Ravenna had given him, and Lord Cormac cut across him without raising his voice. Lord Vassar, you're welcome to contest the procedure. I'd suggest you read document 11 before you invest in that position. Vassar looked at document 11. His mouth closed. Kane said nothing at all. Ravenna stood. She did not look at the documents. She did not look at Celine. She looked at Kyle, who was still standing in the center of the chamber, and the look she gave him had the specific quality of a mother who had spent 38 years being the organizing principle of another person's life, and was now watching that person refuse to be organized. "You don't understand what I built," she said to him. Not loudly. Not performing for the gallery. Directly the way people spoke when the public layer had finally exhausted itself. Everything this kingdom is, every alliance, every border that held, every war we didn't fight because I managed the pieces correctly, that was me. Your father was a good man. He was not a sufficient king. And you... She paused, and something in her face moved that was almost grief, almost the closest thing to it that a woman like Ravenna could produce in a room this public. You needed managing. You always needed managing. Kale looked at her. His face was the face of a man hearing the thing he had always suspected and had always hoped was not exactly true. "I know," he said. "That's on me." He held her gaze. "But you didn't manage this kingdom. You consumed it. There's a difference, and I spent my whole life not seeing it." Ravenna looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Evelina. The look was brief and direct, and Evelina met it without movement, without expression, with the level attention of someone who had nothing left to perform. "You won't know what to do with what you've built here," Ravenna said to her. It was not a threat. It was a prediction from someone who believed in their own assessment of other people the way they believed in mathematics. "You think justice is an ending. It isn't. It's a beginning of something harder." "I know," Evelina said. "I've been building things for 11 years. I know what beginnings cost." Ravenna's eyes held hers for 3 more seconds. Then she looked away. It was the closest thing to a concession she was going to make. Darius moved from the door with 2 Shadow Guard operatives and positioned himself at Ravenna's side. Not rough, not theatrical, the simple physical fact of custody. Ravenna did not resist. She stood and she looked at the chamber one final time, with the expression of someone taking inventory of something they're about to lose, and then she walked with the Shadow Guard toward the side door with a bearing that refused, even now, to be small. The chamber let out a breath. What followed was not a celebration. Courts that had just witnessed the structural dismantling of their own recent history did not celebrate. They processed, which looked from the outside like controlled chaos, and felt from the inside like a building finding its new load-bearing walls. The council moved immediately into emergency session. Vassar and Kane, stripped of the political cover that had made their positions tenable, recalibrated with the pragmatic speed of men who had survived previous regime adjustments and intended to survive this one. Marrow sat very still for a long time and then voted correctly on every measure that came before him for the rest of the morning. Lord Ashfall, who had spent 9 years waiting for this particular room, said very little during the session. He voted. He witnessed. When it was done, he found Evelina in the antechamber and stood beside her for a moment, in the way of someone sharing a silence that had too much in it for speech to improve. "Hector," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I spent 9 years doing nothing with what I knew. Today I did something. Those aren't equivalent, and I won't pretend they are." She looked at him, at the 71 years of him, the cost that was visible in his face. "No," she said, "they aren't, but today still matters." He nodded once, walked back into the council hall. The formal measures took the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. Ravenna was charged under the Allied Territories Compact, patricide, conspiracy, falsification of succession records, the systematic abuse of advisory authority. The Shadow Guard held her in the palace's secure wing pending formal extradition process to the Allied Council's jurisdiction. She would be tried. Evelina did not need to watch that happen to know it would. She had built the case well enough that it didn't require her continued presence to stand. Celine's testimony had been the final piece, not legally necessary given the documentary evidence, but humanly significant in the way that a person choosing to speak truth at cost to themselves was always significant. She had stood in the council chamber with her hands folded over her abdomen and told the room what she knew in a voice that was steady with the specific steadiness of someone who had decided the fear was worth it. When she finished, she did not look at Evelina for validation. She looked at the floor for a moment, and then she looked at the window, and whatever she was seeing there was her own, and Evelina left it to her. After the session, Evelina found Kael in the small courtyard off the eastern corridor, a courtyard she had always liked, stone-walled and quiet, with a fig tree in the center that was older than the palace around it. He was sitting on the low bench near the tree with his elbows on his knees and his head down, in the posture of a man who had been through a significant passage and had not yet located the other side of it. She sat on the far end of the bench. They stayed that way for a while, the fig tree above them, the sounds of the palace in its restructured motion filtering through the courtyard walls. She was tired in the specific way of someone who had run at capacity for 9 days and was only now, in the stillness, beginning to feel the full weight of what that had cost. "The council wants to discuss the governance structure," she said. "The Allied Alphas are proposing a temporary oversight arrangement." "I know," he said. "Ashfall told me." He looked up. His face had the quality of aftermath in it. Not broken exactly, but fundamentally altered, the way a landscape looked different after something significant had moved through it. "They're going to reduce my authority." "Yes." "Is that you're doing?" "It's the consequence of the last 9 years," she said. "I didn't build that consequence. I just stopped hiding it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. Not bitterly. With the flat acknowledgement of a man in the process of learning to hold fair things even when they cost him. She looked at the fig tree. The afternoon light was going amber, the specific quality of late-day sun in the season after the moon festival, the light she associated with the end of things and the beginning of different things. She had sat in this courtyard perhaps a dozen times in 11 years, usually in passing, usually with somewhere else to be. She was aware that this was one of the last times she would sit here. "I'm leaving the palace," she said. He looked at her. "Not today," she said, "but soon, within the month." She kept her eyes on the tree. "The council will need a new framework. The kingdom needs people who aren't standing in the wreckage of this particular history to build it. I can't be in this building and be useful to what comes next. They're different things and they need different people." "Where will you go?" he said. "There are pacts in the outer territories that have been operating without protection or alliance structure for years," she said. "Small pacts, weaker ones that don't have the numbers or resources to negotiate with the major alliances on equal terms. I've been thinking about it since before any of this. The kind of structure that would let them function without requiring them to subordinate everything to a central crown." She paused. "It's a long project, probably the longest I've taken on." Kyle looked at her with the expression she had no name for, the one she'd seen on the rampart, in the corridor, in the courtyard now. It was not love in the romantic sense, and it was not simple grief. It was something more like recognition arriving too late to change anything, which was its own particular weight, and she was not going to carry it for him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's insufficient. I know it doesn't—" He stopped, started again. "I spent 11 years with you, and I never fully understood what I had. That's not something I can apologize my way out of. I just need to say it without asking you to do anything with it." She looked at him. "I know you're sorry," she said. "I believe it. It doesn't change what I need to do." She held his gaze steadily. "You should stay here, Kael. Learn what this kingdom actually is without someone managing it for you. That's the work. It's not glamorous work, but you're capable of it if you stop waiting to be told how to do it." He looked at her for a long time. "Are you certain? About leaving? About me? That I'm capable of it?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I think you're capable of more than you've ever been asked to produce," she said. "Your mother made sure of that. She needed you manageable, which meant she needed you small. You're not small, Kael. You've just been living in a space designed to keep you that way. She stood. That's not absolution. You still made choices, but it's the truth as I see it. He said nothing. He nodded once, the way a person nodded when they were storing something rather than responding to it. She walked back inside. Darius found her in the corridor near her private chambers as the day moved into evening, carrying the particular quietness of a man who had been operational for 36 hours and was still operational but had stopped needing to perform it. Ravena's transfer to the Allied custody facility is arranged for tomorrow morning, he said. The Council has 3 of the Northern Alphas staying for the governance discussions. Selene left the palace an hour ago, her family's territory in the south. He paused. Voluntarily. Good, Evelina said. He was quiet for a moment. They were standing in the corridor where she had first found him 8 days ago, where he had handed her the folded document and waited to see if she would drop it. The torches burned at the same intervals. The stones smelled the same. What happens to the Shadow Guard? He said, not anxiously, the practical question of a man assessing the structural aftermath. That's a council question, she said, but my opinion, if they ask for it, is that the Guard functions best when it's attached to the kingdom's legal structure rather than any individual authority. That means reforming its command charter. She looked at him. You'd have to report to a council oversight body rather than directly to the crown. He considered that. I can work with that. I know, she said. Another silence. Darius Wolf was a man comfortable with silence in the way that people were comfortable with things they'd chosen rather than endured. She had noticed that about him from the beginning. She noticed it now. I'm leaving the palace, she said, within the month. He looked at her. The Outer Territory Project. She wasn't surprised he knew. He was the Shadow Guard commander, and she had been thinking about it in the hallways of the same building he operated in. Yes. That's significant work, he said. Structurally complex. You'd need people who understand security assessment and territorial negotiation. He held her gaze. And who have experience with pacts that have learned to distrust central authority. She looked at him. Are you asking to come? I'm pointing out a practical need, he said. What you do with that is your decision. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full thing, something smaller, the particular expression that appeared when a situation contained something that would have been funny under different circumstances. I'll consider the practical need, she said. He nodded once. The almost smile that lived at the edges of his expression surfaced briefly and then returned to wherever it normally resided. She went to sleep that night for the first time in 9 days with something approaching actual stillness. Not peace exactly, because peace was a word that implied the absence of things that were still present. The grief was still there, stored in the manner she'd been storing it, but no longer requiring active management because the field was no longer active. The anger had done its work and was beginning to settle into something quieter and more permanent, the specific substance that remained in people who had been through real things and come out the other side still themselves. She thought, in the moments before sleep, about what Ravenna had said to her. You won't know what to do with what you've built here. She turned that over, not defensively, just examining it. There was a version of it that was true. She did not know. Not specifically. Not yet. The Outer Territory Project was a direction rather than a blueprint. The alliance structure she was imagining had no precedent in the Crimson Fang Kingdom's history. She would make mistakes. Some of them would be significant, but Ravenna had been wrong about the thing she was wrong about, which was the nature of knowing. Ravenna operated from certainty, 30 years of it, built like a fortress, every brick of it maintained through the elimination of uncertainty and the people who carried it. That kind of certainty was powerful. It was also, Evelina understood now in a way she hadn't fully before, its own particular vulnerability. Certainty couldn't learn. It could only defend. She had spent the last 9 days not knowing several things, not knowing if the documents were enough, not knowing if Ashfall would hold, not knowing what Kael would do when it mattered, not knowing if Selene would speak. She had moved through the not knowing rather than around it, making the next decision with the information available rather than waiting for certainty that wasn't coming. That was not a strategy she had chosen deliberately. It was what happened when you ran out of certainty and still had to keep moving. And somewhere in the running, she had learned that not knowing, properly held, was not weakness. It was the condition that made genuine decisions possible. She slept. 3 weeks later, she stood at the Eastern Palace gate with 2 horses and a packed saddle, and the 14 documents sealed in a case that Petra had prepared for her. Petra, who had been released from house restriction on the second day after the council session and had come to Evelina's chambers that evening and sat across from her and said, without preamble, "Tell me about the Outer Territory project." She was coming too, it turned out. 34 years of archive management in a palace that had used those archives for hiding had left her with a particular interest in building record systems that served accountability rather than undermining it. Darius arrived at the gate at the appointed hour with his own horse and the Shadow Guard charter reform signed and filed with the council oversight body as of the previous morning. He had, in his characteristically direct way, organized his own exit from the Guard's operational command in exactly the manner required and handed the position to Bren with a briefing that Bren had described as the most thorough 2 hours of his professional life. Ashfall came to see her off. He stood at the gate with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the settled quality she had always known from him, and she looked back at him with the respect she had always had for a man who had kept a dead physician's report alive for 9 years because he believed the truth had a shelf life of more than one political season. "Right when you have something to report," he said. "I'll want to know how it goes." "You'll hear from me," she said. He nodded, turned, walked back into the palace with the unhurried gait of a man who had more work left to do and intended to do it. She mounted. She did not look back at the palace as they rode. Not from bitterness. She was done with bitterness, had used it up as fuel the way you used everything up when you were running that kind of distance. She didn't look back because there was nothing in that direction that required her attention now. 11 years. 2 losses that had never been properly grieved and were going to be slowly, in their own time. A marriage that had been a real thing once and had become a different thing and was now a closed chapter that she could hold without it holding her. The road opened ahead of them through the morning, the Eastern Territory unfolding in the specific quality of early light that made distances look navigable rather than enormous. Petra rode beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Darius rode on her other side and said nothing, which was also exactly right. She breathed the cold morning air and felt the horse moving under her with the particular aliveness of a creature comfortable in its own momentum, and she felt something that was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for what lived in the chest of a woman who had been through what she'd been through. It was something more like rightness, the specific quality of a person who had found the work that matched the full weight of what they were capable of carrying. Months later, in the valley where the first of the new alliance territories took shape, a settlement that grew faster than she'd projected because word traveled in the outer packs about a place that asked nothing from you except your willingness to build something. She stood at the edge of the gathering ground and looked at what was assembling itself. Not a kingdom, not a crown. Something more horizontal than that. An arrangement of packs who had agreed to share resources and dispute resolution and the kind of security that came from mutual investment rather than hierarchical obligation. It had problems. 3 of them were significant. She addressed them in the mornings, and in the afternoons she walked the settlement's perimeter the way she'd always walked palace corridors, learning the space by its inhabited details. She had not forgiven Kael. Forgiveness was not the point and had never been the point. She had set down the weight of him, which was different. A deliberate act rather than an emotional resolution. The choice to stop allocating herself to a history she couldn't change and redirect that allocation toward the history she was in the process of making. She thought about him occasionally, the way you thought about a landscape you'd lived in for a long time. Not with longing, but with the particular recognition of someone who understood how a place had shaped them and was no longer living there. She heard that the Allied Council's oversight arrangement had given him more difficulty than expected, and that he was managing it, slowly, imperfectly, with less grace than was optimal, and more honesty than had previously been his habit. She heard Ashfall describe this development as promising, which from Ashfall was the equivalent of unambiguous praise. She read his reports when they came, and she wrote back with the brevity of a woman with a full schedule and a genuine interest in the information. She did not write to Kael. There was nothing in that direction that required correspondence. There had been a real thing once. It was finished. That was enough. On the evening of the first United Gathering, 4 months after she had left the palace, with representatives from 11 outer packs sitting in the valley's meeting circle, and Darius standing at the circle's edge, running a security assessment with the focused calm that was simply his natural state, and Petra at the record table with her ink-stained hands and her catalog of everything that needed documenting, Evelina stood in the firelight and looked at what 11 packs had built together in the time since they'd had the space to build it. She thought about Ravena's prediction. You won't know what to do with what you've built here. She had not known. She had learned. That was not the same thing, and it was, she understood now, considerably better. Knowing was a ceiling. Learning had no ceiling at all. She looked at the faces in the circle, alpha representatives who had come from packs that had been told for years they were too small to matter, too isolated to negotiate, too weak to demand anything but survival. They had built something in 4 months that the Crimson Fang Kingdom had not managed in 3 generations, which was a structure that served the people in it rather than requiring the people in it to serve the structure. It was imperfect. She expected it to remain imperfect. Perfection was Ravena's ambition. That totalizing certainty that the thing you were building was the correct thing, and everything that threatened it was an obstacle rather than information. Evelina had no interest in that. She wanted something that could learn, that could absorb disruption and restructure rather than suppress, that treated the people inside it as participants rather than material. The fire burned in the meeting circle's center, and the evening air came down cold from the northern hills, and somewhere in the settlement behind her, a child was laughing. The full, uncomplicated laugh of a child who did not yet know what the world outside this valley had cost some of the adults building it. Darius came to stand beside her, as he did in the evenings when the operational demands of the day had finished. He stood the way he always stood, present, undemonstrative, the specific quality of a person whose companionship was offered rather than performed. 11 packs, he said. 11, she said. 3 months ago it was 4. Growth tends to compound, she said, when people can see something worth compounding toward. He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. The Ashford Territory Beta sent a message this afternoon. They want to discuss affiliation terms. Schedule it for next week, she said, after we've resolved the Kelmark water access dispute. Already scheduled, he said. Petra had it on the calendar before I finished reading the message. She looked at him. The scar that ran from his brow to his jaw caught the firelight differently depending on the angle. Sometimes like something carved, sometimes like something the years had simply accumulated. She had stopped noticing it in the way you stopped noticing anything that was simply part of the landscape of someone you trusted. Darius, she said. He looked at her. I'm glad you came, she said. Not as a declaration, as a statement of fact, delivered with the plainness she gave to things that were true and didn't need ornamentation. He held her gaze for a moment. I know, he said, and in the specific register of who he was, that was everything. The acknowledgement of a man who did not speak frivolously, offering the one response that matched the weight of the thing she'd said without adding anything that would diminish it. They stood in the firelight while the meeting circle filled and the 11 packs settled into the business of building something together. She was no longer the Luna they had blamed. She was not yet fully whatever she was becoming. She was in the middle of a long project with imperfect materials and real problems, and 11 packs who had chosen to trust something she had not yet finished building. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. The fire burned. The valley held its breath and then released it, the way living things did when they had found their rhythm. Not perfect, not permanent, but real and ongoing, and theirs. Evelina Blackthorne stood in it and breathed and began again.